Hello and welcome to ELTtime with Garnet Education, where we talk with an industry guest about the hot topics and what's brewing in the ELT community.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode about teaching pronunciation for teachers whose first language isn't English.
With the help of my guest, Nicola Meldrum, we are here to dispel the myth that non-native speaker teachers can't teach their students pronunciation, and to give you reassurance that teaching pronunciation when you are a non-native speaker with an accent is entirely valid. So welcome, Nicola. It's really nice to have you here with us today. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about your background and your ELT experience as a teacher.
Hi, Una, and thanks for inviting me to do this podcast. It's lovely to be on the show with you. I got into ELT quite a while ago now, in 1999 when I did my Cert TESOL, and then went on to work in various contexts, business English, general English, teaching kids, adults. And then after getting my diploma, after a few years, I got into teacher training and taught for years doing Cert TESOL training and various other local trainings. I'm based in Barcelona, so most of that was in Barcelona or around in Catalonia. And now I'm freelance actually, and I got a bit into materials writing and methodology writing. And now I'm a teacher trainer and actually the course director on a Trinity Dip TESOL course. And that's based in Oxford TEFL in Barcelona. So I suppose the DIP TESOL has quite a big focus on pronunciation, and that's when I became more interested in that as a specialist area. And about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I started writing a blog with my colleague Mark McKinnon, who's also a teacher trainer, on the diploma and a teacher in the Autonomous University of Barcelona, as it's translated. We were having a conversation over lunch the other day and I was telling him about doing this podcast, and it was very interesting because they have a policy at the university in Barcelona of diversity and employing teachers from different backgrounds. So they have a very mixed group of teachers, some whose first language is English and many for whom it's not. And yeah, it was really interesting, and they do a lot of teacher development and they have a lot of focus on pronunciation. So I think that's quite an encouraging bit of information that I got the other day.
Yeah, that kind of non-native speakers are very valid proponents of teaching pronunciation to students who want to learn English. And are your students all from the Mediterranean? I mean, are they Spanish, or are they diverse nationalities included in that?
Well, I'd still do a bit of teaching, and most of the students are from Catalonia, so speak Spanish and Catalan. But sometimes we do have students from other parts of the world as well, particularly Russia, China, Japan. So there is quite a mix at the school where I work. And in terms of teacher training, I'm really happy to say that the diploma that we run has teachers of all different nationalities and first languages. You know, I don't think there's any reason to think that if you don't have English as your first language, you're a native speaker, then you can't reach those levels of pronunciation, teaching and knowledge and expertise.
And how do you develop confidence within those teachers who do feel slightly unconfident that they can't replicate a kind of RP English accent? How do you approach it with them?
Well, really from the first go, because that often comes up. I interview teachers for the course, and in that interview they often express that as a concern. And so we start talking about it from the get-go, really, and saying that, you know, that's really no reason. And actually you can be a better model for your students, because maybe some received pronunciation accent is a very difficult model for your learners. You know, they're not going to reach that level. And you know, what is that anyway? I don't speak RP. I've got a Scottish accent. So actually having a very good model who's a teacher who has the same first language can be very motivating, I think.
And of course, and they're more aware of the potential problems and pitfalls and areas that might be pain points for students. And so what kind of training then do you give them in terms of pronunciation? Can you outline the sort of program that they then study?
Yeah, they do 4 weeks on the course of pronunciation, and we start off by looking at some of these questions about how do we integrate pronunciation into lessons in an effective way. And they also learn the kind of the knowledge that they learn about phonology as a subject. So they learn everything from individual sounds right up to suprasegmental features of intonation and sentence stress. So they learn it all, but also there's a big emphasis on how do we actually put this into practice. And so they have to do lots of things like make videos of them demonstrating how to produce an individual sound, so explaining and modeling the physical placement of the mouth. And they have to answer questions about phonology, and they have to write lesson plans where they integrate pronunciation activities into those lessons. So it covers everything really.
Wow. And how do you get them to imitate the sounds that they have difficulty with, or communicate how to teach those sounds? Is there a specific procedure?
Well, one of the things that we do is, I think, Adrian Underhill's phonemic chart has become so central to a lot of ELT materials, and a lot of schools have it in their classrooms. He's got the app now with a kind of American and British English. But we also have Adrian Guest on our course, and we ask him about that and say, well, I've got a Scottish accent and my accent isn't fully represented on your chart, and maybe someone else has a Birmingham accent or a French accent or a Chinese accent. And he's quite clear about it and says, well, it's all about something that's close to that sound, which is going to help that shouldn't become clearer and be able to identify versions of that sound. So often we play with it and we say, well, we've got the oo and the o and the a, and we encourage teachers to try and mimic different accents actually. And that's something I do in class. I might be teaching my Spanish learners the long E and I sounds or other sounds and vowel sounds in particular, and say, like, we've got the short coat as a Scottish person might say it, and coat as an English person might say it, and I ask them, which do you prefer, which is easier for you? So we definitely encourage teachers to play with different accents and be confident at mimicking them for their learners, and saying, giving it the control over to the learners a little bit of saying, okay, which of these versions is easier for you to produce? Which do you prefer? They're all valid.
That's very interesting. And they said they distinguish between specific sounds and choose the one that they feel is more accessible.
Yeah, exactly.
And how do you deal with the passage from their own pronunciation, which is obviously influenced by how they speak, to bridging the gap between that and communication, i.e. Effective communication using a clearish accent? How do you bridge that gap?
Well, I suppose it's like any accent, it's getting them to the point where they're intelligible.
Yeah.
And, there's some research that's been done about this quite a while ago now by Jennifer Jenkins and Barbara Seidelhofer. They did some research mostly at university, in a university context, to find out what elements of pronunciation were considered core elements for mutual intelligibility and comprehensibility. And they said that, all consonant sounds are very important, except maybe the difference between th and th. And they came up with other elements. So that is one starting point, I suppose, that teachers can look to and students can look to and say, well, these are quite important things for me to become intelligible. But then I think there's a lot more to it, and it's not just about being intelligible, it's about being effective. And that often means a lot more work at sentence stress level, at intonation level, at connected speech level. So they're not just intelligible in that they can produce individual sounds quite effectively to be clear when they speak, but that they can actually become effective and get their point across using, we use pronunciation so much, don't we, to add to the message.
Yes, exactly. And how do you encourage them to say, work on intonation within sentences? What kind of strategies do you use for that?
I use a lot of recording, so I get students to record themselves, and I also do a lot of work where in pairs and small groups, because often students, especially if they come from, if their first language doesn't use intonation to the same extent, every language has intonation in it, but maybe it's different the way they place it, or it's not as exaggerated as English, then I think doing it with the whole class and lots of individual drilling can be quite intimidating. So I try and do work where they learn to exaggerate their intonation and play with it, but in a comfortable, safer space. So often doing that in pairs and small groups encourages them to feel a bit more relaxed and to experiment a bit more.
Yeah. So you would set a scene and have the work in groups and initially model that, and then have the students play around with the intonation.
And I think it's important that they get a model as well. And so, anything to do with sentence stress and intonation is so connected to the context that you're teaching. So all the practice really has to be meaningful and relevant to the context that they're learning about that day in the lesson. I strongly believe that pronunciation should always come from the objectives, the language objectives and the communication objectives of a lesson, and not just be sort of like the old-fashioned prawn slot that we used to call it when I first started teaching, where you just do a random bit of pronunciation. So I think, giving as you say, more listening and video input where they're seeing pronunciation in practice. And video is great because you get the context across a lot more effectively.
Yeah. And how can teachers assess how effective their students' pronunciation is? I mean, if they've got them to kind of work on areas that are very difficult through imitation modelling and playing around with the language, how can they then identify and assess how effective their pronunciation is in a real context?
Well, I think the first thing they have to do is when we're planning lessons is to create enough space in our lesson so that we can listen to our students. And that means lots of pair work and group work where students are working both in a controlled way on their pronunciation and then trying to also be mindful of it when they're doing a freer activity. And then the teacher has to imagine themselves in that moment and think about how they're going to listen to their students and what exactly they're listening for. So I think when we're planning, we really have to be careful to think about those moments and the not silly things, important things like the classroom layout. Will we be able to hear students? What exactly are we listening for, so that we zoom in on that? So if they're working on some specific sounds, that's what we listen for when we're monitoring, and we have an expectation of what kind of accuracy we're expecting. And when we feed back on that accordingly, either on the spot or afterwards when they finish speaking, if it's something a bit freer. So I think when we're planning, we can really think about that. It's quite difficult to assess, isn't it? Because it's quite subjective. But I think, we can listen to pronunciation and know if it's acceptable and intelligible. I don't think we have to come up with too finite a way of measuring it. I think it's like anything else. It's either quite accurate or not. Grammar is quite accurate or not. Word choice is accurate or not. I think pronunciation is the same, and we can be confident about listening to it and saying, okay, I think you need to open your mouth a little bit more there, or spread your lips a little bit more there, or put your tongue a bit forward, or increase your intonation there, not there. Or you're putting the stress on the wrong syllable there. But I think if we preempt that and plan it into our lessons, then we can assess it in a really focused way. And also, if by planning that, I think we're a lot more confident about teaching it. If we leave it to chance, then I think maybe a lot of teachers skip the pronunciation or don't correct it enough or sufficiently or in depth because they lack confidence in it.
And how would you correct a student, just to clarify further for listeners?
It depends. I mean, the rule of thumb is that if you're doing something quite controlled, then you correct them on the spot, and there's lots of different techniques. You can, just with some signal or gesture, you can prompt self-correction if you think they can do that. or you can maybe open it up to their peers. Or you can give them some instructions like open your mouth more, as I was saying, or say it louder, higher, longer. Or you can model it again and get them to try and repeat it by listening to you. So there are lots of different techniques we can use. We can use the board a lot as well. With word stress, we can show the syllables, we can draw pictures of the mouth, we can use lots of visuals. There's lots of great videos out there as well, but this is more for delayed correction, I think. So
Yeah.
if we don't want to interrupt the students on the spot and we want to address a more general problem that more than one student has produced, then we can do some delayed correction after the activity, bringing the class back to the board. And I think a good way to do it is always to ask them a question, not explain it. So sometimes if, say, students are having problems with word stress and they're saying hotel instead of hotel,
Yeah.
I might write the word on the board and then say it in both ways and say which is correct, which syllable is stressed, how many syllables are there, and teach it through questioning techniques rather than going straight in to listen and repeat and drilling. Because I think that little just cognitive moment of getting them to think about it can help the pronunciation stick a bit better.
Yeah, it's a great tip, breaking it down and getting them to really sort of own the word and know about it and then say it.
Yeah, exactly.
And do you ever direct them to the internet to kind of listen to it again, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of students now have their phones, and as they're learning vocabulary, they can look it up and now they can hear the word, not just see it in a dictionary. Online dictionaries all have the option to listen to the word, which I think is great.
Brilliant. I wondered, Nicola, if you had any sort of tips for teachers, non-native teachers who do kind of suffer from a bit of a lack of confidence, how they can improve their own pronunciation. Sort of, I mean, you've talked about preparation, which is really key, going into the classroom. How can they improve their own confidence in their own pronunciation in their own time?
Well, a lot of the teachers that I speak to on the course say that one thing that's really helped them improve their pronunciation is watching lots and lots of television programs and films and sort of almost trying to imitate and shadow as well. Short clips, even, or podcasts as well. So listening and trying to shadow. The shadow's like when you speak along with something. And with podcasts, it's great because you can actually slow them down a little bit as well and listen to them at like not half the speed, but a little bit less. Some podcast sites allow you to do that. And so the listening really helps feed into their pronunciation development. I think that's one of the best and easiest things that we can do. And maybe if you're in a class, in a staff room environment, a lot of staff room, depending on where you are in the world, there's a lot of different languages going on, and maybe in some staff rooms there's not a lot of English, but maybe trying to have a bit more English in the staff room is a good way of developing pronunciation. Just having English as the, or even if it's not all the time, just have like a few English hours where people are speaking in English and helping each other with their pronunciation. I know that that's something that happens here a lot in primary and secondary schools in Barcelona, where there might be a lot of English teachers, and they have their meetings once a week. They usually have a meeting at lunchtime in one of the schools I've been working in. So, have your meeting in English and correct each other's pronunciation, help each other, ask questions, and don't just leave your English to the classroom.
Kind of English hour where you're sort of working together.
Yeah, exactly.
And Nicola, I don't know if you can pinpoint some key pronunciation issues that people have across the board. Is that a very difficult thing to do? I know there's lots of variance within different nationalities.
Have you got any particular nationalities in mind?
Middle Eastern students. Do you know anything about any difficulties they might have and how to address those?
Yeah, because we through the course that I run, a lot of teachers do action research into pronunciation. And so a few things that they've looked at with Middle Eastern students are the problems between p and b and v and f. So that the voicing basically of those four consonants. Because Middle Eastern Arabic speakers have problems with the voicing of those consonants, so they mix them up. So instead of park, they will say bark. And so I think there's lots of work to be done with the physicality. Sometimes we jump straight into doing minimal pair work, which is great, but we need to backpedal and start off by getting them to hear the difference and then see the difference and feel the difference. I think those 3 verbs are good to like see, feel, and hear before you say it. You know, they can look at the letters and see that there's a relationship between the spelling and the sound. They can listen to us say the 2 sounds and then start to see where our lips and our teeth are. And then they can try and produce that themselves and feel it in their own mouths. And then try and do some minimal pair activities. There are loads of, if you type minimal pair activities into search engines, I'm sure lots and lots of activities come up. But I think work needs to be done before those kind of activities. And then stuff has to be done after that as well, where maybe it's extended into a more communicative task where they maybe have to write some questions using some of the words or create some tongue twisters or something where they're using the words in a longer utterance or in a communicative activity. So that's great for individual sounds.
And if I can just ask you, Nicola, just kind of as we're drawing to a close, what your top tips would be for teachers, non-native speaker teachers who are teaching pronunciation. Have you got any top tips, say 3 or 4, that you could give them?
Yeah, I think number 1 would be to start finding the pronunciation in your lessons and trying to teach like one thing each lesson. Don't try to address too many things so that you have time to prepare that thing and feel confident going into a lesson. So say it's individual, you know, you're teaching some language and you think, well, you know, I think my students are going to find these 5 words difficult to hear and say. And some of the common sounds in those words are these 3 or 4 vowel sounds, for example. And you can then go off and think, right, okay, how am I going to teach these to show them how to produce them physically? Am I going to draw pictures on the board? How can I get them to distinguish between the sounds? So that's all you're doing that lesson. So when you're planning, find the pronunciation point that you want to teach and prepare a small short activity where you're getting the students to hear and feel the sounds. Then you can do listen and repeat, even if it's just that, and then try and build in some activities if you can as well. The second is, I suppose, lose that fear of pronunciation. Start reading about it and learn about phonology a little bit more as a subject, because I think what happens is when we start teaching, we often use course books and ELT resources, which are all great. But if you look at the contents page of a course book, you'll see lots of terms and terminology related to grammar and vocabulary, but not about phonology. They're not saying, oh, in this lesson you're going to learn elision of the d and the t. It's just the language isn't in there. So teachers don't learn about phonology as they do about grammar and about vocabulary. So I think go and read a little bit more about phonology, and that will boost your confidence as well. And reach out to other teachers in the staff room. What we do on the DIP is we team up people a lot, because we find on the CERT so we find that native speakers of English can be really helpful when it comes to pronunciation, or just more proficient speakers of English. I don't really like the term native and non-native. I'm trying to move away from it. And people who've learned English as a second language can really help other teachers with grammar. So we kind of, you know, if find your strengths in the staff room and don't feel shy to ask for help as well, and feel that you can bring something to the table as well with your language learning experience.
It's great to share the knowledge and boost each other's confidence, really.
Exactly. And also my final point would be to trust in your learners. And don't feel that you have to be this kind of expert RP sounding model, but that you and your learners are on this journey together. And often I get the students in the class to actually be the model for each other. I find that there's always one student who's really good at pronunciation. And they then become the model for those who aren't as good. You know, so that's their strength and their moment to shine. So instead of me drilling and leading the pronunciation work, sometimes I ask students to be the star of pronunciation for that lesson. So I think teachers can trust in their learners as well to learn it for themselves and not feel that they always have to be the explainers and the teachers in the traditional sense.
That's a great idea, and you boost confidence. You can help the other students in the class, and you've got some student taking the lead. That's a great idea. Lovely. Thank you, Nicola. That's incredibly interesting, helpful, and some really great tips and ideas there for teachers who maybe don't feel as confident in this area as others. I think you said you'd be uploading some of your materials for us, so teachers can come and look and maybe consult those.
Yeah, sure. We've also got a blog, so we can link to that, and there's lots and lots of ideas there. But yes, I'm more than happy to help with some materials and other tips as well.
That's lovely. Yeah, so we will put those on our online site, and there's kind of details about that at the end of the podcast. I just wanted to thank Nicola again for her time and expertise.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicola. And I hope it's been helpful for everybody listening, and do keep in touch with us and let us know how you're getting on. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.
And that's it from us today. If you'd like to get in touch or to see our latest updates, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook at Garnet Education, or head to garneteducation.com/podcast for show notes and information about today's guest. Thanks for listening!